Can everybody hear me? We're going to start right away. Is everybody ready? So we're going to, hello everyone, welcome to those who are just joining us in this Gaia room on offshore wind. And I will be taking over from Olivier, so I also invite people either to take a seat or to leave the room as we will be starting in a few seconds, maybe. So towards industrial sovereignty or an aggravated dependency, that was the title of the former roundtable. It was dedicated to the industrialization of offshore wind with a focus on France. A good title for this first episode of the morning. The second episode coming up soon with a title that is quite affirmative. Offshore wind produced in Europe, strategic ambition. So this is about sovereignty at the European level. Sovereignty, very strong word, a very meaningful word that rhymes with liberty, freedom to choose our destiny in terms of energy supply, but also in terms of jobs and security. With the offshore wind, the challenge today is to create the space for European industry that was for a long time a world leader that still creates jobs, but let's not hide it, that is facing the gigantic Chinese competitors. There'll be more and more powerful machines in offshore wind, with parks that are going to be further and further away from the coast, particularly in the Mediterranean Sea, which is a deep sea. So at the beginning of this, the end of this year and beginning of New Year, it is going to see the commissioning of the first 3 pilot farms with 10 megawatts on the French coast. So that will give us a lot of good feedback. We're also going to look at the strategies to have a lot of European content in the farms of tomorrow. The first is going to come real in 6 years in Brittany. We're going to talk about 250 megawatts. Some other will follow with the different tenders. We won't talk about megawatt, we're talking in gigawatts. So let's look into the cooperation between the ports of the south of Europe. What are our limits? What are our assets? We have about an hour and a half ahead of us to share and exchange. There'll be 2 sequences. There'll be a quick roundtable with our speakers, and then we'll open up the conversation to the room, and you'll be able to send me your questions. You've already done that with Olivier on a QR code. Maybe we can put it up. Yeah, here we go. You can scan it, and I will receive on my tablet your questions. And at the end, if we're good with time, we will even be able to ask questions and pass the mic in the room. So I'd like to invite Emmanuel Villerme, who's in charge of energy transition at Avolène, and Alexio Pico, who's General Director of Circle Group. Hello to both of you, and welcome. We'll excuse Olivier Guiraud, who was supposed to be with us, and he was held back, so we'll miss him because he was one of the person to give us some feedback on those pilot wind parks. So we'll just have a few images on that. And then we'll have on a video conference, I don't know if they're here with us already. Oh, yes, Xavier Guilloux from the European Commission, and Alexandre Frémaux, who's an analyst with Wind Europe and who replaced Phil Cole at the last minute, who is sick with the flu. So thank you to both of them to be with us online. And I would like very much if we could start with Xavier Guilloux. I don't know if we can... Does Xavier, Xavier, you...
Oui, je vous entends, je vous vois.
Yes, I hear you and I see you. You are in charge of the renewable marine energy with the European Commission, and planning, maritime planning at the European Commission. So we manage all those spaces in a cross-cutting way, like environment and defense, with policies that are sector-based, like fishing or marine energies. In terms of renewable marine energy, can you tell us, Xavier, how does the union can back two major goals that are hard to combine? Quick, massive development of gigawatts per hour that are green, not too expensive for the consumer, and on the other hand, backing European industry facing the Chinese competition that aims to provide a sustainable European market with the public tenders. How can we combine those two goals, Xavier Guillaume?
Bonjour à toutes et à tous
Hello,
depuis Bruxelles.
everyone
Merci
from
pour
Brussels,
votre
and thank
invitation
you
pour
for your
cet
invitation
échange.
to
Alors,
this
effectivement,
roundtable.
comme vous l'avez indiqué,
As you
l'Union européenne
mentioned,
a
the
un cadre
European
commun,
Union
une
has a common
directive sur la
framework, a
planification de l'espace
directive
maritime
on the
depuis
planning of
2014,
maritime space since
qui engage les
2014
États membres
that
côtiers de
engages
l'Union
all the
européenne à adopter
coastal
un
member
plan de
states
son espace
to
marin
adopt a part of their
depuis
marine space
2021.
since
À
2021.
ce jour, 20
So to
États
this
membres
day,
sur
20
22
member
États membres
states
côtiers ont
out of
rempli
22 of the
cet
coastal state
objectif,
members have filled this
qui est
goal.
structurant pour
This is a
un
structuring
certain nombre
goal
d'objectifs et
for
notamment pour la filière
a number of reasons,
de
particularly
l'éolienne
for
en
the
mer.
sector
Alors,
of
un
offshore
certain nombre
wind.
d'États membres, notamment en Baltique, en mer du Nord, avaient déjà une
Certain
tradition, une
member
expérience de la
states have
planification
realized
marine
that
intégrée.
the North
Mais pour
Sea
de
has an
nombreux
experience on
autres États membres, il
planning and all
s'agissait d'un
that, but
premier
for some,
exercice de
so they were more comfortable with it. For
d'ensemble.
some of them, it was a
Et on voit que
completely
cet
new
outil a
exercise, and
été
we see that
développé de
this tool
façon
was developed
conjointe et
jointly
de façon coordonnée au niveau
in a
transfrontalier,
coordinated
à un moment où la
manner
filière éolienne,
at a
notamment
time when the
supposée,
wind sector
s'accélérait
is accelerating
en termes d'ambition.
in
Et
terms of
effectivement, ces
ambitions.
outils
And these
donnent une
tools
visibilité,
give
une
us the
sécurité
visibility
à la
and the
filière en termes
security to the sector
d'identification de
in
zones,
terms of identifying the areas,
alignement avec un
aligning with a timeline
calendrier d'appel d'offres.
of public tenders.
Et aujourd'hui, on voit que
And
ces outils
today,
de
we can see
planification
that
à
those
moyen,
planning
long
tools,
terme,
mid-term and long
jusqu'à vision
term, up
2050, sont
until
importants
2050,
pour
are very
atteindre
important
de façon coordonnée différents
to
objectifs en termes de
reach
protection,
a number of
conservation
goals,
du milieu marin
protection and conservation of
et de la
the
transition
marine
énergétique.
space and
Pour
energy
rappel,
transition.
en
In
2030,
2030,
l'Union
the
européenne s'est
European
engagée à un
Union is
objectif
committed
d'au
to
moins
a goal of at least
42,5% de la consommation totale
42.5% of
d'énergie
consumption of energy
d'origine
from
renouvelable. Et l'éolien en
renewable
mer apparaît
sources,
comme une
and
option
offshore
crédible
wind
pour
energy
accélérer et
sounds like a
contribuer
credible
à
option to
l'atteinte de cet
contribute
objectif.
to reaching this
Comme vous
goal.
l'avez indiqué, parce qu'il est
As
possible
you
de
said,
massifier
because it is
autour
possible
d'un
to
projet
massify
des volumes
around
importants,
important
beaucoup
volumes around the
d'équivalents dans
project.
d'autres secteurs
And
dans
there
d'autres
are
secteurs de
many
l'éolien. Les fermes éoliennes à terre sont de
examples.
taille
The wind
beaucoup plus
farms
réduite.
are smaller.
Et
If we
pour ça, la
compare,
Commission
and to
européenne,
do
avec les
that,
États
the
membres, a mis
European
en place
Commission with the
une
member
stratégie
states have put in place a strategy
2020
since
pour
2020
intégrer les
to
différents
integrate
éléments de
the
cette
different elements
accélération
of this acceleration of
des énergies en mer,
energies
à la
at
fois
sea,
via des
via
coordinations sur la planification
coordination
des
on
réseaux nécessaires
planning
bien
of
en
the
amont,
networks that we
sur le
need,
développement
on the
d'outils
development
financiers et
of financial
d'accompagnement,
tools,
sur de la recherche
on
et de
research
l'innovation
and
orientée sur les
innovation focused on
technologies émergentes
emerging
dont le flottant.
technologies.
Et enfin, cet effort d'avoir
And
une
this
approche
effort
intégrée
to have an integrated
a été
approach
rappelé cet été.
was
Au mois
reminded
de juin, la Commission européenne a
this
présenté
summer at the
à
Commission
l'occasion de la conférence des Nations
during
Unies à
the
Nice sur les
conference of the
océans,
United
le pacte
Nations
européen pour
in
les
Nice
océans,
for
et qui
the
vise
ocean
notamment à développer une
that
politique
aims at
intégrée
developing
maritime
an integrated
afin de
marine policy
stimuler
in order
l'économie
to
bleue européenne.
promote the
Et un
blue
des enjeux de cette
European
commission
economy.
est réellement la
It's one of the
compétitivité et l'accès à
challenges
une source
that we have
d'énergie
to create
bon marché
energy, affordable
et sécurisée.
energy. Xavier Guillou, we're going to talk about more with Alexio Pico. The ports are the anchoring of the European industry of offshore wind because we need to store all those huge floaters. So that means that we really need to prepare the area with the ports. How can we guide the choices to have an impact locally of those European choices? What is in the pipeline there?
Oui, tout à fait. Les ports sont perçus à la fois comme un enjeu de décarbonation en tant que tel, comme outil industriel, mais aussi comme un élément de la chaîne industrielle pour cette filière. Il y a un fort appui et encouragement du Parlement européen. La Commission européenne travaille sur une stratégie industrielle portuaire et maritime qui sera présentée dans quelques mois et qui mettra particulièrement l'accent justement sur les ports comme outil industriel. Et cela se décline sur un certain nombre d'outils financiers dédiés
financial tools which will be dedicated to industrial infrastructure.
Notamment, par exemple, le pacte européen pour une industrie propre qui a été présenté il y a
for industry, etc., which was presented a couple of weeks ago. Thank you very much, Xavier Guillou. We'll see you in a few minutes' time. We'll stay in Brussels with Alexandre Frémaux from Wind Europe. Alexandre, are you with us?
Oui, tout à fait. Bonjour.
Are you with us? We can't see you, but we can hear you. Hello, Alexandre. You're an analyst, offshore wind farms for Wind Europe. You work for this association, which is the voice of the wind farm industry. The idea is to strike a balance between all the components and the French players. EU planning for wind farms holds out great promise for ramping up production in the years to come. Perhaps you could talk about the European industry. Is it prepared to produce all these gigawatts? Or is it, on the contrary, a wonderful opportunity for the Chinese industry?
Merci déjà pour l'invitation.
Thank you for this invitation.
Merci pour l'organisation.
Thank you
je sais pas
for organizing the roundtable.
Il est possible de me montrer les slides.
I don't know whether you can see the slides. Yes, perhaps we could see the first slide. From here I can't do it. Maybe this device will help me. Okay, there we go.
Très bien. En fait, l'introduction, je voulais juste prendre un peu de recul, effectivement, pour introduire cette table ronde focus sur l'Europe, faire un peu un état des lieux de où on est l'offshore wind à l'échelle européenne. Donc on a actuellement environ 37 gigawatts d'installés en Europe. Comme vous pouvez le voir sur la carte, principalement dans les mers du Nord, principalement la mer du Nord, mais on commence à avoir des capacités installées également dans la mer Baltique. Donc ça représente quand même... Tout à fait, merci. Tout à fait. Donc oui, les points bleus sont les capacités en ligne, les points verts qu'on distingue à peine sont les capacités en construction et les points jaunes, les capacités en développement, ou dans le cadre d'appel d'offres ou dans le cadre d'autres systèmes sur le marché. Donc comme je le disais, ça représente quand même un certain nombre de turbines, autour de 6 000 turbines, donc 140 fermes sur cette empreinte géographique.
In this area.
Si on peut passer à la slide suivante.
Next slide, please.
Pour avoir justement le focus sur le flottant.
I'd now like to focus on floating wind in Europe.
Merci beaucoup. Donc en fait, c'est vraiment pour faire le contraste avec le flottant, qui est bien entendu une technologie
floating wind is an emerging technology, of course. A certain number of countries are well positioned, like France, the UK, and Norway.
Du Sud, pardon, excusez-moi. Aujourd'hui, à ce jour, on a environ 200
We
mégawatts
have
de
about
capacité
200
flottante
megawatts
installée à travers
installed
l'Europe.
floating wind capacity in
L'Europe
Europe.
reste un leader à
Europe
l'échelle
remains a
mondiale,
leader, a global
avec,
leader,
il me semble, 280
with
mégawatts installés à l'échelle
280
mondiale.
installed
Les
megawatts
50
around the
mégawatts
world.
restants
50
sont localisés en
remaining
Chine
megawatts are
principalement.
located in China
Donc on
mainly.
parle de 32 turbines
So we talk about
flottantes
32 floating
posées
turbines
sur des fondations flottantes à travers
on
l'Europe,
floating
à travers
foundations
10
around
différents.
Europe.
Encore une fois, ici, l'idée de la carte, c'est de bien se rendre compte que
Behind this map
l'empreinte
is
géographique
to
est différente.
show that
Là,
the
aujourd'hui, on
geographic
voit une
footprint is
pipeline de
different.
projets qui
You can see there are lots
est
of
assez importante,
projects in the
bien entendu en
pipeline
Écosse, mais également en Europe du Sud, autour de
in
l'Espagne, de
southern
l'Italie,
Europe,
du
Spain,
Portugal, de la Grèce et
Italy,
bien entendu de la
Portugal,
France,
Greece, and of
avec
course
une
France,
pipeline
with
assez, qui en tout cas dans une nouvelle phase de maturité.
a big pipeline that's becoming more mature. How do you view development? That's the next slide, perhaps, the development of floating wind in Europe. And what about your analysis of the way in which France is coping compared with its European neighbors? Are we up to scratch? Are we exemplary? Where would you situate
Je pense
France?
que c'est aussi important, c'est l'occasion de ce genre de session de rappeler que la France reste
I'd like to say
précurseur
that
et en
France
tout
is
cas
a
a fait
forerunner.
un premier mouvement, en tout cas sur le flottant, qui est remarquable.
It's
L'unique pays qui a
made
effectué ce genre de
fantastic
mouvement par des
progress
appels d'offres
with the
spécifiques pour
floating
le flottant,
wind.
c'est
There
le
have
Royaume-Uni
been
qui reste
the UK
entre
has
guillemets
issued a lot of
la
calls
maison
for
mère de la
tenders.
technologie
The UK
offshore.
is sort of the
Donc la France est première
parent of
positionnée là-dessus,
offshore
notamment avec les
wind.
appels d'offres depuis la O5.
There have been
Là aussi,
many
ce qui a
calls for
suivi, et,
tenders.
bien sûr, et ça a été mentionné lors de la précédente session qui
As
était
mentioned in
focus
the
sur la France.
preceding session,
On
which
attend avec
focused on
impatience la
France,
O9
we're
et la
eagerly
O10.
awaiting
Même si ces
the
derniers ont tendance
calls for tender
à
9
être un
and
peu en
10.
retard. Voilà.
Okay, on this slide, we can see projections
Tout à
per
fait.
country.
Tout à fait.
In dark blue, you have the UK,
Mhm.
and France is yellow.
En jaune, tout à fait. Donc en fait, à Wind Europe, on travaille
In fact, at
de
Wind
manière
Europe,
annuelle sur
we work
des
annually
prévisions à horizon
on
2030 pour l'offshore, mais
forecast to
également pour le
2030
wind,
for offshore
l'éolien terrestre.
and
Mais là, on va
land-based
se
wind
focus
farms.
sur l'éolien en
Here
mer,
you
si
have
vous
a
permettez.
focus on
Donc,
offshore wind.
à Wind Europe, on estime qu'environ
At Wind
80
Europe, we
gigawatts à
think
l'échelle
about
européenne,
80
donc ça
gigawatts
inclut
in
l'Union
Europe
européenne et bien sûr le Royaume-Uni,
will be
sera installé à
installed
horizon 2030. Le
by
message ici,
2030.
c'est que
The message here
des 37 gigas qu'on a déjà d'installés
is that
aujourd'hui aux
with the
80
27
gigawatts, il y a
installed
50 gigawatts
gigas, there are
installés. Donc,
50
dans les 50 prochaines années, on
installed, and
va
over the
avoir des
next 5
installations
years,
dans
we'll
plusieurs
have
pays. Là, vous
further
voyez, en fait,
facilities
par
in a number of countries.
Le Royaume-Uni aura la
The UK
plus grosse capacité,
will
mais
have a big capacity.
l'Allemagne, la Pologne, les Pays-Bas et
Germany,
la France
Poland, the
complètent
Netherlands,
le
and
top
France
5.
are
Ce
in
qui est
the top
important à mettre en
5.
perspective
What's
ici, c'est
important,
que
as you
l'Union
can see here,
européenne, mais également le
is that the
Royaume-Uni a mis
EU,
en
but
place
also the UK,
des targets à horizon
have
2030,
targets
qui est
for
qui est
2030.
une target intermédiaire avant
That's an
d'atteindre les
intermediate
objectifs de
target
zéro à
for
horizon
attaining
2050. En termes de capacité installée
the carbon
d'offshore
neutral
wind.
goal in
Xavier l'a mentionné
2050,
juste
as
un
Xavier
peu
said
avant.
earlier on.
L'idée ici, c'est que
The
Wind
idea
Europe
here
une espèce de mise en garde dans le sens où ces
is that
targets
we
ne
have to
seront pas
be
remplis à
careful
horizon 2030.
because these
On
targets
parle
may not be
d'environ
met by
130 gigawatts
2030.
de
We're
targets
talking
si
about
on
130
consolide les
gigawatts.
targets
That's the target if
de
we
l'Union européenne
consolidate
et du
the
Royaume-Uni.
UK and
Donc il y a bien un
the
gap de
EU.
50 gigawatts à combler si on
So
veut atteindre les targets.
if we want
Le
to
fait
attain
est
the
que
target, we have
le message ici,
to
encore une fois,
make
c'est
up
qu'elles
for
ne
the
sont pas
missing
remplies
capacity.
car l'offshore wind, ça met du temps à construire.
Offshore wind takes time to
C'était
build,
également mentionné dans la session précédente, il
as
me
mentioned
semble.
in the preceding session, I think.
Malheureusement, le temps entre
Unfortunately,
que le projet soit attribué dans un appel d'offres et sa construction
the time between
est très très long.
allocating a project
Notamment en
and actual
France, en
building
moyenne en Europe, il me
is
semble que
very
c'est 7
lengthy.
ans.
It's 6 or 7
En
years.
France, on
In
parle
Europe
plus de
and
10 à
France,
12 ans.
it's more
Donc
10
vous
to
imaginez bien
12 years.
qu'entre
So you
2025
can
et
imagine that
2030,
between
on a
2025
déjà une
and
idée assez claire de ce
2030,
qui pourrait être construit dans ces 5 prochaines années.
we need to have a clear idea of what's going to actually be built. Okay, we've been talking about red tape in France. Can one reduce the actual
C'est
time
pas une
required
tendance
for
qu'on
building?
voit, malheureusement. Sur le cas spécifique de la France, sur
In
certains
the
projets, elle a même
specific case
tendance à
of
s'allonger.
France, times
À
are
l'échelle
extended
européenne,
for many
encore une fois, je l'ai
projects.
mentionné, c'était 7
As
ans.
I said,
Et
in
certaines
Europe, the
choses
average
qui
time is
doivent être
7
mises en
years.
place, notamment au niveau des règles de permitting, qui sont
Permitting
notamment
rules are complicated.
incité par l'Union européenne à être mis en place par les États membres.
Is encouraging member states to
Les États
speed
membres
things up.
malheureusement ne le font pas. C'est quelque chose en tout cas qu'on pousse à l'échelle européenne, mais je pense que Xavier pourra nous en
We're
dire
working on
un peu
this
plus
on the
là-dessus.
European scale, but maybe Xavier would like to talk about it in greater depth. And then there's a focus on floating wind here. You can see the flags this time round.
Alors malheureusement la slide est un peu petite, j'espère que vous
Unfortunately,
voyez
the
bien,
slide
mais
is a
oui
bit
voilà.
small. I hope you can
Vu
see
que
it.
en tout cas vous êtes à Montpellier, il nous tenait à cœur également d'avoir un focus sur le flottant.
I wanted to
et là
focus on
malheureusement
floating
également c'est un
wind.
espèce de rappel à l'ordre
This is
et
a
un
bit of
rappel
a
à la réalité.
reminder of how things actually stand.
On pense quelles sont les capacités flottantes
You can
construites à
see
horizon
the
2030.
floating
Donc à
capacity
Europe, on
up to
estime qu'environ
2030.
1 gigawatt est possible
1
d'être construit,
gigawatt
mais seulement
may
si
be
les
built,
appels d'offres
but
sont complétés
only
d'ici 2026.
if
Donc là, je parle
the calls
bien
for
entendu
tenders have been
de
completed by
l'AO 9,
2026, if the auctions
éventuellement de
have
l'AO
been
10,
completed.
et aussi
We're talking
spécifiquement
about
des appels
AO10
d'offres
and the various
britanniques.
auctions.
Pour ce qui est des pays du Sud, ouais.
There are two
Tout à fait.
flags, the Italian and the Spanish one, which are a bit vague here. What does that mean?
Ouais.
The flags aren't
Le
as
fait est
clear.
qu'en fait, sur les marchés du Sud, la situation est un
In
peu
the
plus
southern
instable.
market, the
Dans le sens
situation
où il
is
y
a
a
bit
eu
more
une grande
unstable
ambition
because there
déclarée au
are
début des
major
années
declared
2020,
ambitions
même
at the
avant,
beginning of the
sur
20s
la technologie flottante, car
in the
je le
area
rappelle, sur les
of
pays
floating
des marchés
wind
du Sud, que ce soit le
in
Portugal, l'Espagne, l'Italie,
Portugal,
la Grèce
Spain,
et
Italy,
d'autres comme
and
Malte, par
Greece,
exemple,
and Malta, for example.
la technologie posée n'est pas possible.
You
Donc on
can't
parle
have
uniquement de flottant et donc les ambitions étaient grandes,
anything but
mais
floating
la
wind
première étape
farms.
pour lancer un marché, c'est
The
bien
first stage to
de
launch
mettre en
the
place des appels
market
d'offres. Et
is
ces
to
appels
win
d'offres étaient
the
prévus
auctions,
pour
and the
les horizons
auctions
au début des années 2020.
were
Aujourd'hui, en
planned for the
2025, on
beginning
n'a
of the
toujours pas vu
2020s, and now we're
l'ombre d'un appel d'offres sur ces
2025, and
marchés-là.
we still haven't
Aujourd'hui,
seen
il
an
est très dur,
auction for
au
those
vu de la
markets.
situation régulatoire là-bas,
Given the regulatory
d'envisager
situation
quelconque
in
installation
these
à horizon
countries, it's
2030
hard
malgré
to
les
think
ambitions
that there
politiques.
will actually be facilities built by 2030. Well, we'll have to see about the situation in Italy, for example, when it comes to the absence of these auctions which were announced. Thank you, Alexandre. Stick with us because we'll then field questions. And now I'd like to turn to you, Emmanuel. You're in charge of the energy transition at Evola, which is an unknown association, which is 95 years old. You don't look that old. Thank you. They group together companies in the oil sector. You have a number of majors and also systems manufacturers for refineries, offshore platforms, engineers. You work in the marine environment. That's obviously interesting when it comes to wind farms. We've talked about the ecological transition, hydrogen, gas, and so on. With floating wind farms, that's a new opportunity for development for many of your members. What kind of cooperation can one hope for between the historic partners of offshore platforms? Alexandre was saying, for example, the UK is really the parent when it comes to working on offshore energy. So what can one learn from all this? And this floating wind farms, they're a very new technology. Thank you very much for this question. Thank you very much. And thank you for this invitation. Of course, I have to start by saying a few words about Evolen, because as you mentioned, we're not very well known in this landscape and in the EnerGaïa ecosystem, even if we have a stand, and don't hesitate to come and see us. Historically speaking, we were created in 1930. We comprised players in the oil industry mainly. In 1930, the energy landscape was very different from what it is today. We didn't yet talk about offshore wind, let alone floating wind. It was mainly oil and gas, but onshore, so a lot has happened. We've moved from the onshore to the offshore in ever deeper waters. People drill at several thousand meters depth, just to give you an idea. So our association has changed. and we're currently a multi-energy association. Our role is to bring together the players in the supply chain. French players, and there are big groups implanted throughout Europe and even elsewhere. But we focus on the supply chain. We're interested in all kinds of energy, and our players, bit by bit, have turned towards offshore wind. We have an offshore wind committee chaired by Arnaud Vigtal, who you may know from Eiffage Métal. The aim is to orchestrate this industrial momentum and try and corner these markets for our industries. Now, to answer your question more specifically, well, offshore wind is very recent. 20 years ago, it hardly existed. I looked at the past history, and I was quite young when the industry began. I read my history, and in Denmark, it's in Denmark that things started. People started talking about the first offshore farms. I mean, they were talking about a couple of 100 kilowatts, 1 kilometer from the coast. So look where we currently stand. Now we're a real industrial area in Europe that's developed. It's very competitive. It's one of the most competitive in the world, even if there are some weaknesses today, which have already been mentioned. And in fact, we have both the incumbents in oil and gas, and there's a mix with other players who are pure players in renewable energies and land-based wind farms, which then have moved into the offshore side of things. Of course, there are lots of skills that can be transferred in terms of offshore engineering. Look at the jackets, the semi-submersible components. That really springs initially from the oil and gas sector offshore. And now all this is being used in the offshore wind energy industry. One can build facilities at sea using big ships and towboats. There's inspection and monitoring with the submarine components. You have to be familiar with corrosion, fatigue, the materials. All this know-how has existed in the oil and gas sector, and it's been transferred to this new industry, which is offshore wind. Also, you have pure players, which we all may be familiar with, the turbine manufacturers, the foundations, substations, cables, and port facilities, which we may talk about later on. So France, or rather Europe, because the focus is Europe, Europe has champions, industrial champions, which enable us, I think, to have a value chain which is sovereign and competitive, even if today we have to organize it well to avoid a real vacuum which will encourage the Chinese to rush in. We don't want to open things up to Chinese competition. We've talked about the oil and gas sectors, exploration and what have you. People sometimes make mixed statements, the RTE and others, they refer to renewable energy, offshore wind. Of course, I'm just oversimplifying the situation, but how do your members view these statements? Because it's not the core business of most of your members. After all, are they saying, well, let's wait and see, we have to be cautious, or there are ups and downs, that's normal in any learning curve? Obviously, there are ups and downs. You talked about majors from the oil and gas sector who perhaps have backtracked a bit. They've revised their strategy. That's not surprising given the geopolitical situation in the world, given what's happened to the west, certain people who've been very disparaging when talking about offshore wind. And one shouldn't forget that we have major players in this segment who are massively investing in the technology. So I would tend to see the glasses half full. We have Total Energy, we have ENGIE and Total, which are major players in Europe in the area of wind farms, offshore wind. People, they tend to focus on land-based wind farms. That accounts for the most turnover. 37 gigawatts have been installed. Most of them are on fixed platforms. If they're at sea, here we're talking about floating wind farms. The supply chain is shaping up. It's just the beginning. What I wanted to say is with fixed wind farms, you still have issues with R&D even if it's mature. In Toulon in October, we organized the International Offshore Wind Technologies, and there are still R&D issues when you talk about increasing the power of the turbines. Substations need to be ever bigger, so there's quite a lot of R&D that still has to be done, despite the fact the area is quite mature. Now, as to floating wind farms, everything remains to be done. I don't know whether... Well, we'll talk about this later, perhaps. So thank you very much. I'd now like to turn to Alexio. I'll try a word in Italian, but that's about all I can say, and I'll continue in French, and you're going to talk to us in English. So thank you very much to our interpreters this morning. Alexio, you're the managing director of Circle Group. You run this firm based in Italy. You founded it about 10 years ago. It focuses on analyzing maritime transport markets, logistics, ports, and you have a very European vision. It's hardly surprising. Italy, for a long time, like Spain, has this ability to turn to Europe and cooperate in Europe. In France, I think we need to learn some lessons in this area from you. And you're an independent expert for the European Commission on assessing innovative projects. You work to develop all these areas. You have identified just 2 years ago the potential of offshore wind, and hence I have a question for you this morning. What was the trigger 2 years ago? Why did you suddenly say, well, there's something happening in this area?
Good morning, first of all. Thank you very much for inviting me in this very nice conference. Thanks, Frank. My name is Alexio Pico. I'm the managing director of the Circle Group. And as mentioned, we are headquartered in Italy, but we have also some other offices elsewhere in Brussels for the European Affairs Consultancy and in Portugal either. And as mentioned, we have been working with ports since the last 15 years. And what happened is that in 2020, with the Green Deal, there was a totally new approach toward ports. Before, ports were recognized as connectivity hubs, but later on, since 2020 onwards, they started to be seen as a potential energy hub. This started mainly on reasoning on alternative fuels, so whatever could be used in maritime transport as alternative fuel. That is much more than land transport, because in maritime transport you have not only hydrogen, but you have methanol, ammonia, more than LNG. And then, little by little, came also into the offshore wind. And little by little, it depends on geographical areas. You have seen clearly the differences. I started personally to work a little bit on it with some ports in Ireland some years ago. Okay, different technology and whatever, but I started to understand why the port was so important, and I supported them to get some funding from the European Union for port development linked to offshore. And when back in Italy and in the Med, I started the reason is why we are so late comparing, and what's happening there. And we really started to understand, also visiting ports, and had the chance to visit Porto La Nouvelle already in spring 24, and to see concretely what they are doing to be prepared. So with some Italian ports and the Italian framework, we decided to launch this platform called Offshore Wind Revolution. That was, it is mainly an event so far, started in October 2024. The first one and the second one was arranged in Palermo, where we were really able to cluster all the not only the Italian but the Mediterranean, let's say, industry behind. We have in this Offshore Wind Revolution a so-called steering committee that is formed by all the main, let's say, associations also working in it. Wind Europe is part of it, and as some embassies that are interested in developing the Met offshore they are also part of it. And I think it was a very nice. They were very nice events in which we were really able to understand where the Met is, not only Italy, because these are international events where is more the Met industry that is discussing and it's more than discussing, because the event is organized in a way that is not only a conference. We have also working groups in which people is really discussing and suggesting and proposing how to go on, technologically speaking, institutionally speaking, funding speaking, and so on. So, in a sense, the market is starting to be mature also in Italy. That was, shown as areas not still developed. It is very true that until the auction are released, the system is not going.
Alors justement, voilà les appels d'offres.
Yeah.
Alors les appels d'offres, effectivement, voilà, ça a été évoqué par.
So the auctions were mentioned by Alexandre Frémaux from Wind Europe. Why aren't the auctions taking place in Italy like they are in France? It's interesting to see what happens in France. There are regular calls for tender, regular auctions, sometimes with gaps, but reasonably we can believe that there will be more auctions in the future. Why, after this first announcement, has Italy not done anything in terms of auction? Is it a policy or a political problem?
It is a very difficult question for me. It is for sure somehow a political issue, for sure. What is really clear is the potential of in the industry. What happened finally, let me say, is that some months ago, the government has decided and released some funds to invest in two ports, the port of Augusta in Sicily and the port of Taranto in Puglia. And Taranto will be the next location for offshore wind 2026, by the way. And this is already a good step. I know for sure that the public-private partnership to invest and develop, I'm talking about Sicily now, is quite ready to do it. We had a very in-depth technical visit to the port of Augusta, joint with the Offshore Wind Revolution event, and they are really investing a lot. We know that there is an enormous potential in employment, that for the south of Italy is, of course, a very good possibility. But then the question, why we are still there? So there is a political issues behind, for sure, that I cannot, of course, enter more than into that. We do, let's say, as a cluster, we do really hope that this is going to happen in early 2026. If not, it's going to be an issue, because if not, we are going to a long way of being closer to the next elections that in principle are in 2027, but they can be anticipated. And so if not, but we do hope that this is the moment. Everything else is moving, and we can elaborate a bit more in some later on. But yes, I think we are ready to go. But of course, it's not my my duty to go for the auction.
Et peut-être, oui, bien sûr. Peut-être une dernière question.
Of course, one last question.
Comment vous voyez une possible coopération?
How do you view possible cooperation between European ports around the Mediterranean and, of course, in floating wind energy? We have specific characteristics around the Mediterranean.
That's a very important question. The ports are used to, they are strange animals in a way, because in a way they compete. Okay, they want all to attract traffic, to attract freights and passengers and whatever. On the other hand, it is also true that there are a number of topics in which they can cooperate quite well, and they do already. And offshore wind is one of them. One of the things that I've learned on offshore wind when I started to be into the sector is that in most cases, specifically for floating, you need more than one port to do it. One port is not enough for the land that is needed, for the complexity of the logistics of the operation. So the cooperation between ports is essential. And more than that, it is essential to me that we are, and to us, that we are working at TU level to have, let's say, a sea basin approach, and in this case, to have a Mediterranean cooperation. Okay? First, because we have a different technology that it should be developed, and we have learned, we have also listened a couple of minutes ago that it's still not fully mature, and cooperation may lead also to more standardization, reducing cost, and many other things. So my experience, our experience in ports cooperating in specific topic is quite good, and the Med is the correct, is a very proper area to do it. I think that we have been discussing, and with the Port of La Nouvelle that is also ready to launch this initiative and to try to get other ports, the ports of Augusta, port of Taranto, Greek ports that we are working with, ports in Spain, even Portugal, even it's not still really Mediterranean as a sea, but in terms of industrial capability is there. I think there is a big potential in bringing ports together and cooperating for many reasons. One is also funding. That is also important. It's funding for innovation, it's funding for research. Catalyzing ports working together brings also our colleagues in the European Union, and not only, to focus some funds that could be dedicated to cooperate at the Med level to develop the technology and the skills. I was very happy to listen in the previous roundtable the work that in France you are doing on skills. I think even in Italy we are a little bit behind, but we need a lot. Only in the terminal in Augusta, not in the old port, but in the terminal, they need 500 people in few years. If the auctions are ever. That is a lot, and it is in 2 or 3 years. And the majority of them are skills that are not existing, or they are not there because they are specialized technicians in between, let's say, the engineers and the people, let's say, on the ground.
Merci, Alexio. Merci, Alexio.
Thank you, Alexio. We were supposed to have Milly Gawash, the managing director of Carême Marine, with us, but he had a last-minute hitch. That's a pity. He could have shown you a number of things. I'll try and show you this picture. Here you have the picture of the week, which he sent me, and you can see it on the screen. Could we have it in a larger version?
3 machines, 10 megawatt each. It's sitting on its floater. You were talking about investment. We're at Port La Nouvelle, and this is with the port of Brest, the French port that banked the most on this sector of offshore wind. It represented a lot of investment. In this case, it happened with the region Occitania. You can see how important the regions are for that. On the Italian side, it's probably the same idea. This regional vision that must be in your DNA as well. That must be very important to you as well, Alexio. Let's look at it quickly. 80%, this is the number that you see here. This is a real success. 80% of the construction costs made by French companies. That was the challenge of EolMed, and this challenge has been met with some regional skills as well that have been used. Some issues as well. Olivier Guéraud could have told us more about this, but very concrete skills. For example, there were some welders that came on the site, Practically none of them were French. It was at the European level that we had to go look for these welders, and most of them were above over 50. So if we want to develop those gigawatts that we're talking about we're going to need people to really implement those gigawatts. And we're feeling like maybe there's going to be a blocking point there if we don't have younger people to do that, the young generation. So these are the major components. I don't want to get into that, but we see the link which each country, the synthetic lines in the middle coming from the UK, the towers, wind towers, the cables, the underwater cables from the UK as well. Spain, Cyprus for the linking Italy as well, Croatia, you could see on the metal side. So there's a lot of things coming together. And I asked Olivier Guéraud if we could tomorrow on the commercial farms, because Eolmed today is coming as a pioneer for the commercial farms of tomorrow. They're going to answer with Eni, which is a subsidiary Italian company, Eni, to a major call for tender that is going to come through soon. We're talking about 250 megawatts. We're going from 30 megawatt to 250 megawatt. It is a huge jump, and this is going to serve as an experiment, but also, and I'm talking in his name, we'll be able to keep these 80% of local content and European content. And he told me, no, it won't be possible today. Probably not. But we'll go back to that. And the vision of wind Europe will be interesting from that point of view. So this is a pilot view. It's very promising. So we're going to move on to our open roundtable with your questions. I already received a few questions from the QR code, and you can go ahead and send me more questions, and it's going to come on my tablet, which I have in front of me. If you have any question, I'm going to maybe start with one question for Alexandre Frémaux, who's in Brussels. Let's go back to one of the curve that we saw early on, the forecast for 2030 and beyond. The question is, why is France evolving very slowly? Because that was the graph compared to Germany and the UK. Alexandre, can you hear my question?
Oui, tout à fait.
Yes, absolutely.
Tout à fait.
We hear you.
Très intéressante cette question.
Very interesting question, but I'd like first to go back to another point, because the graph that were shown just before depicting a very pessimistic view of the sector. There's a momentum that we're losing, and there have been a lot of articles in the press or forums of the sector that saying that the sector is not doing too well. It is true that we're coming at the end of a cycle where the situation of wind energy is degraded, wind on land, but also offshore wind. The truth is that we're always also coming out of the golden age, and that's why I wanted to insist on. And look at something that was mentioned by Emmanuel. If you look 25 years ago, the UK celebrated actually the 25th anniversary of their offshore wind energy yesterday, I believe. There's room for improvement, particularly for the turbines with more power. We need to know that. And yet being aware of a situation that is less good for the sector. But as at the European level,
on réitère que
we want to
on
repeat
a besoin de
that
support
we need
pour
support
améliorer le business
to
case
improve the business case
de l'éolien en mer.
of
C'est pour ça
offshore wind.
qu'on appelle
And that's why
le prochain
we're
moment
calling
fort de l'éolien
the
en mer,
next
aussi
time
bien pour
the
la
strong
France
moment for
que pour les pays de la mer
wind
du Nord, qui
energy
se passera en
for
janvier
France
2026
or for
lors
northern
du sommet de
countries.
la
It will
mer du Nord
happen
organisé en
in
Hambourg.
the early
Et lors de ce
2026
dernier,
during the
nous
summit
porterons un
of the
message
North Sea
de
at
la part
Hamburg in January
d'entièreté
2026, and
du
we'll
secteur
carry the message from
en
the
appelant
sector by
un
calling
nouveau
for
deal,
a
le
new
Offshore Wind Deal,
deal, a new
et à appeler
offshore wind
justement
deal,
les États
and
membres,
to
donc
call
à
all
la
the
fois
member
la
states,
les
France,
Pays-Bas, la Belgique,
Netherlands,
l'Allemagne, le
Belgium,
Danemark
Germany, Denmark,
et le Royaume-Uni
and
et
the
la Norvège en
UK
tant qu'État
and Norway
partenaire,
as a
à
partner
réitérer
states to
un engagement en termes de volume. Et
renew
je pense
their
qu'en fait, c'est un peu
commitment
là
in
la
terms
clé
of
pour
volumes. And I think that's going to be the
combler
key
ce retard, et à la fois
to
le
bridge
retard
this
français que vous
gap
mentionnez dans votre
and the
première question,
French gap that
c'est
you mentioned in your
que
first
les
question
gouvernements
is going to be
se réengagent
bridged
à une
by the
régularité
fact
dans les
that the
volumes
governments are
des
going to
appels
commit
d'offres et
to
également de leurs
volumes
promesses
in the call
passées.
for tenders
On
and
appelle dans
to
le cadre de ce
honor
New Offshore Wind
the
Deal
promises they
au
made.
gouvernement
So this new
à mettre
offshore
en
wind
appel
deal
d'offres un
is
minimum
going
de
to be a
10
chance for
gigawatts
the
par an à
government
partir de
to
maintenant pour des
make
projets qui seront
available 10
construits dans la décennie 2030,
gigawatts per year for
également
projects.
backés par des CFD, mais ça on pourra y revenir plus en
And
détail.
and on the question, why is France moving so slowly on your graphs compared to Germany and the
Je
UK?
pense qu'il
Can
faut,
you answer
pareil,
that
il faut aussi
precisely?
prendre un
Well,
peu de recul
we
et
need to
voir
take
où
a
la
step
France
back
était
and
il y a
see where
quelques
France
années
was
avec
a few
les
years
premiers
ago
AO
with the
pour les
first
projets comme Saint-Nazaire et Dunkerque
projects
qui datent
for
des
Saint-Nazaire and
même plus 2020,
Dunkerque
bien
that
avant.
would date back
Donc il y a eu
from before
véritablement
2020. So there was really
un démarrage au diesel finalement très lent. Là aujourd'hui on voit
very
enfin
slow
les premiers
start.
projets avec Saint-Nazaire qui
We
étaient
see
construits
the
il y a
few
2-3 ans,
projects with
Saint-Brieuc,
Saint-Nazaire,
Fécamp qui ont enfin été
that are
installés.
finally were installed.
D'autres projets encore de
Some other
construction et
projects
effectivement
of
il va y avoir
construction.
un trou d'air à horizon
And there's going to
2028-2029 et ce
be
dernier s'explique par justement cet
a
arrêt dans
hole
les appels d'offres et
in the
d'où
call for
l'importance
tenders
de ces appels
very
d'offres
soon.
que ces appels d'offres soient rapidement mis en
But
œuvre
we need to
pour éviter
implement
ces
them
espèces
very
d'effets
fast, those
start and
auctions,
stop comme on dit,
to
et qui
avoid this
sont
start
bien
and
nuisibles pour la
go,
filière à la
start
fois
and stop,
française mais également européenne.
stop and go approach. This question, open question to you, Alexandre. Can we reasonably expect in terms of job creation, and what types of jobs can we expect linked to the offshore wind? If we look at the next decade, and what can we put aside? We're thinking, let's not stop dreaming. This is not going to be possible. What is feasible and what is not feasible? In terms of, or maybe Emmanuel can take this question. I don't have the vision, the best vision on that. I only look at the data that at the European level, but there's this observatory that is edited every year on the energy at sea. There's some numbers that were reminded to us in the introduction by the vice president of the region. I think I noted that in 2024 is 8,000 jobs that are stabilizing. It's linked to the life cycle of the projects. The good news in terms of job creation is that coming from jobs that are marine jobs, there's there's a rescaling risk, but it also depends on how we want to make our sector attractive, because those jobs are typically construction jobs. They're not particularly linked to offshore wind. We talk about welders, they're used in other types of construction industries. So we're competing with other sectors, other low carbon sectors, like the nuclear, for example. So we're competing with those. There's a French culture there of those type of jobs. Yes, more, yeah. And this is the responsibility of everybody here to guide the talents towards these type of jobs. In terms of volume of jobs, I don't have any numbers to share with you. Alexandre.
J'allais sauter
Alexander, do you have
effectivement
a
sur
vision
l'occasion
on
pour aussi donner la
jobs? Yes, I
perspective
wanted
européenne et en fait
to
rappeler les
jump in
enjeux.
and give you the
Le chiffre de 8000
European perspective. The
personnes actuellement
number of
employées par
8,000
l'industrie éolienne en
people
mer en
employed
France,
by
il est très juste.
offshore wind in
Nous, à
France
l'échelle
is
européenne,
correct.
on a justement,
At the European
on va justement
level,
publier un
we
rapport
are going to
lundi
publish a
prochain
report
sur
next
un
Monday
état des
on the
lieux
state
et des perspectives sur le nombre
of the
d'emplois
union and the
dans
prospects
l'industrie
of the
éolienne de
number
manière
of
générale,
jobs
avec
in
également une
the
sous-section
wind
sur
energy
l'éolien en
in
mer.
general
Et on
and
chiffre
offshore wind also.
aujourd'hui, en
And
2025,
in
à 50
2025,
000 le nombre
we
de personnes en Europe employées
think that
par
there are
l'industrie
50,000
éolienne en mer.
people
Donc
employed
c'est quand
by
même
offshore
significatif,
wind
c'est
throughout
un certain nombre
Europe.
de
So
personnes
it's quite
qui
a
travaillent dans cette
significant
industrie
number.
qui est
It's
justement à
a
sauvegarder. On
quite
parle
big
beaucoup
number of people are employed in this
de
sector.
transition énergétique,
So
mais
we talk a
aujourd'hui,
lot about
l'éolien en mer, c'est bien
energy
entendu un sujet
transition,
stratégique.
but
D'ailleurs, c'est le titre
offshore wind is a
de la
very
session.
strategic part of it. That's why it's the title of the session.
Donc aussi une question d'emploi.
And
Dans
this
cette étude qui sera donc
creating jobs as
publiée
well,
la semaine
of course.
prochaine, on
So in
estime à
this
environ 150 000
survey,
au
we
total en
imagine
Europe le nombre de personnes qui
150,000 in
pourraient
Europe,
travailler
1,000 in Europe, number of
dans le
people
secteur de
who could
l'éolien en
work
mer.
in
Et
this
pour donner un peu la
sector,
vision française, ce
offshore
chiffre
wind. And the French
se
vision,
décline à
it
11
will
000
be
pour la France en 2030.
11,000
Donc
for
11 000
France in
personnes, 11 000 Français qui
2030.
travailleraient dans
So
le secteur.
11,000
C'est
French people
significatif
working
et je
in
pense
this
que c'est un
sector is
chiffre qu'on a
quite a
envie de
big
porter auprès
number,
des pouvoirs
and
publics pour rappeler que
this
il
is
y
a
a un
good
vrai
chance
enjeu
for us
d'emploi et
to
donc
reaffirm that our sector can create jobs. We need training programs to do that, and we would need Olivier Guiraud because he knows about that. Do you have a vision of the needs that we would have for on the sector?
Alors là-dessus, je suis pas sûr que je pourrais vous répondre.
I'm
Mais je
not
pense
sure I
qu'il y a
could
des choses
answer
très
you on
intéressantes qui ont
that,
été mentionnées lors de la
but
session
some interesting
précédente,
things were
notamment
mentioned in the
avec
previous
le
session,
représentant de l'université de
particularly with
Montpellier.
the
Nous, dans ce
representative
rapport,
of
on
the
appelle justement
University
une
of
collaboration plus
Montpellier.
forte entre
We would
l'industrie et le
like to
secteur
have a
académique.
strong collaboration
Également un
between
soutien
industry
un
and
soutien
the
des pouvoirs
academic
publics pour
world,
justement
and also
comment
being
dire,
backed by
faciliter ce genre de
the government
partenariat.
to
De notre
promote
côté,
this
il y a
type
également
of
du
partnership.
travail.
We have a lot of work to
Le
do
secteur
on
de
our
l'éolien
side.
en
The
mer est nouveau et le
offshore
secteur
wind
de
sector
l'éolien
is
flottant
new.
encore plus. Et donc
The
les métiers
wind
associés,
energy sector
même
is
s'il
new
y a
in
des
general,
redondances
and
avec
the
les
offshore
anciens
wind is
métiers
even more
de
new.
l'oil and gas qui ont
So
pu être,
even if we
qui a pu être
collaborate
mentionné
with
par Emmanuel,
some jobs from the oil and
sont
gas
par pair. Et
sector,
en fait, il y a un panel de métiers
but there's a
différents
lot of new
tel qu'il
jobs
est
that have
compliqué pour
emerged
des
that
jeunes
are,
justement
so it's
d'identifier
complicated
des
for
potentielles
young
filières
people
de
to
carrière
identify
dans lesquelles se
the
lancer.
career
Donc
path
de
that
notre
they want
côté,
to
on a aussi un
choose.
travail à faire.
So we have to explain better to these young ones. And for the more mature sectors in the energy sector, you're reading the room, you're waiting for feedback on offshore wind. Yes, it's not directly linked to these questions of job creations, but I wanted to talk about the fixed sector, which is a mature sector that represents a big part of the turnover with competitive rates. On the offshore sector, it's a bit different, even if some could be surprised by the prices of the first commercial farms in France with rates that were lower than what we expected. And what I wanted to say is that these 3 pilot projects that were launched in France that have brought positive things with a great technical feasibility. There were a few delays, but it happened. There was a strong mobilization of the local actors with a local impact in the regions, and there's a great role played by the ports. So it worked in France. In Fos-sur-Mer, in Port-la-Nouvelle, we know how to assemble those wind turbines. Those 3 projects are working, are operating. And the point that I wanted to make is that those are pilot projects, so not everything went as planned, and there are some companies of the supply chain that only they suffered economically and financially. They had some major losses.
je pense, on doit entendre,
And I think we need to hear that.
qui est avec des pertes significatives. Je parle pas de quelques
I'm not talking about a few dozens of thousands of euros. We're talking about much more money.
Nous, on s'est engagé
So we committed on Evolen side to be to do some feedback on those pilot projects to identify what has worked and what has not worked so well. So we'll move on to the second phase of those commercial farms. So we can really take some lessons and avoid falling into the same traps. So in 2026, and we will hear out all the people who were part of the supply chain to get their feedback. So we hope that they will all do it. Questions on the French and European ports, maybe for Xavier Guillou, if you're still with us. Xavier, are they ready for the development of offshore wind? Or do we still, or are we ready or not?
Merci.
Thank
Merci
you.
pour cette
Thank
question.
you
Moi, je reviendrai
for this
peut-être rapidement sur
question.
votre
I
image
would
de la
like to get
semaine
back of
et
your image of the
féliciter
week, and I would like
projet
to
Olmed
congratulate the
pour la Nouvelle
EOLMED
et la région
project
Occitanie
pour la Nouvelle and the Occitania
cette étape
region
marquante
for this
de
major
l'installation
milestone in
du
the
projet en mer. C'est quand
installation
même,
of a
on est sur une
project
phase
at sea. That
d'apprentissage
means that we're on a learning
de
curve,
très grande envergure,
a
même
very high
en termes de
scale
logistique, la
learning curve
préparation
in
de
terms
quais
of
lourds, les
logistics to
investissements,
prepare the case,
les
the
investissements à moyen terme, des
investment,
tirants d'eau très importants, des transbordements en mer
transport at
sur
sea,
sur différents et l'usage de différents
and
remorqueurs. Donc c'est déjà une
using various
performance
trailers.
logistique
So
sur
the
lesquelles
logistic performance is
on apprend
quite
beaucoup et
impressive,
les ports
and the ports learn
également.
a lot with
Comme ça
that.
avait été mentionné précédemment, les ports travaillent
The
aussi en
ports are
réseau.
working
On le voit
in network. We could see that
sur l'éolien posé.
on
Tout est d'échelle
the wind
gigantesque dans
at
l'éolien en mer
land-based
et dans les posés, ça
wind
c'est
farms.
encore le cas avec les spécificités des
And
flotteurs. Donc, de toute
it's
façon,
going to
il
be
faudra à la
even
fois une
more
logistique
complicated with the
près des
offshore
côtes, une
wind with the
logistique
floaters. We're going to need
de
the
câbliers, une
logistics
logistique
on the
de
coast
remorqueurs,
to trail out
logistique
them
de
at
stockage,
sea, to store them,
et
etc.
une
And
industrialisation qui
we're
encore
going to
se
need an
mettre en place pour
industrialization
notamment les pièces
for
majeures
the
type
major
flotteur
parts, floaters, of course,
sur l'éolien flottant.
on
Donc
the
il y a une
offshore wind.
coordination qui se fait au
So
sein de
there's going
l'industrie. On sait que
to
l'Europe
have
a un
a
réseau actif de
coordination.
ports
We know
dans
that Europe
l'éolien
has a very active
en mer,
network of ports
avec une dimension sud qui se développe
in the
également,
south
plus
of Europe,
orientée sur
particularly focused
sur le flottant.
on
Et puis
offshore.
rappeler que
And
l'Europe est un
also, let's remember
partenaire,
that Europe is
une base industrielle
an
majeure en termes
industrial
d'industrie
basis
maritime, de très
for
gros
marine
opérateurs en
industry.
Europe,
There are major
capables de mener à
operators in
bien des
Europe
projets
who are
extrêmement
capable
complexes. Et
to
là, en termes de
conduct some very
compétitivité,
complex
c'est
projects.
un vrai plus
So it's a real
de
asset
cet écosystème industriel
that we have
avec
this
des
industrial
opérateurs
ecosystem
mondiaux
with
capables
world
de développer des projets majeurs.
operators capable of
Plusieurs
developing
ports
major
européens se
projects. Major
spécialisent, vous avez mentionné
a
Brest,
few
vous avez mentionné pour la Nouvelle,
European
également
ports are
Fos-sur-Mer.
specializing on this. Pour la
D'autres
Nouvelle,
opérateurs
Fos-sur-Mer.
le font,
Other
notamment
operators
en
do it
Espagne
in
ou
Spain
en Europe du Nord,
or in Northern Europe
pour
to
anticiper les besoins de
anticipate
volume,
the
aussi
needs
bien
for volume
d'assemblage
in terms of
que de
assembly
stockage.
or storage.
Mais encore une fois, la direction pour les prises de décision en
But
termes d'investissement, c'est vraiment
the
le
decision making
calendrier d'appel d'offres,
that's really
qui
important
soit
is
pas
the calendar of the call for tenders. We really want to make sure that we're not on a stop and go mode and that we don't have visibility just for the next 5 years, but for the next 15 years. So we really need to shake this up. The political commitments are usually held. It's a huge pipeline of projects, but we need to make it concrete and to be coordinated.
Avec les États membres
And
européens,
with the European
d'avoir
member states, we'll try to
visibilité
have
accrue sur l'ensemble
better
des
visibility
pipelines d'appel
on
d'offres
all the
des
pipelines of
principaux
call for
États
tenders
engagés
for the
dans
major
l'éolien,
states
justement
committed
pour que
into
la
wind
filière ait cette
energy
visibilité
to
et
make
y
sure
compris la
that
filière
we
portuaire,
have
parce que c'est les
visibility
ports
and
qui
that
doivent
the
être prêts en
ports have
premier,
visibility because they need to be ready
pour
for it.
anticiper encore plus que
So
les
they
autres
need to anticipate
investissements
even
sur le
more
site.
than others
Donc la
on
visibilité
those
sur les
heavy
appels d'offres est
investments.
réellement
So really needed
réellement
to
un
have
élément
this visibility
majeur
on the
pour
call for tenders,
investir dans
to
l'étape de
invest
commercialisation
in the
à plus grande
commercialization
échelle.
stage.
Oui, on Ça, c'est du coup, on rebondit avec.
Okay, so let's go back to Alexio. We're waiting for the Italian call for tenders that I'm sure are going to come very soon. So what about the specific needs on the port side for offshore wind in terms of engineering? Have you identified that properly? For Italy, are things, have you started? Where are you at? Or do you still have a big step forward to make? Where are you at exactly in Italy?
I may say that the two ports that have been identified for offshore, Augusta and Taranto, they are already working on it. The Augusta specifically, they are already doing a lot of investments and preparation, moving, for instance, some terminal container section of the yard in order to prepare the space. They need to reinforce a little bit the yard in order to accommodate the heavy floaters. They have already arranged the space in front of the yard and in front of the pier in order to assemble the floater, so they are working on it. But again, I come back here on the fact that it could be very important for the Italian ports to have a sort of, let's me call it Mediterranean floating wind alliance with others, where complementarity of ports is the really key. It could be a key factor for success. This is very important because a port alone, it's difficult that they can manage the complexity of the floaters and of the big wind farms that we may probably have in the future. Alone, they cannot really handle the needs of the training skills. I gave you the examples of what we are trying to do in Italy to create the skills hubs, but we need to have the experience of the French to do that together, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense. And in order to do that, it's important to stress that this complementarity. So we need to do this together with Wind Europe, together with...
Mais alors,
yeah, sorry.
Oui, alors la question c'est effectivement.
The question is in France, the French ports are trying to get together. We can see that on the Atlantic side to have this complementarity at a local level. What is the interest to have complementarity between, I don't know, Barcelona, Genova, Angusta in Sicily, Port La Nouvelle, Fos? Concretely, it seems far away, right? All these ports among themselves. I have a hard time understanding how it can put itself in place concretely.
There are at least three main aspects for me. One is the industrialization of the floating wind. Meaning that working together, it may lead to standardization of many elements of the complex logistics and industry, and this is very important in terms of supporting the European industry to reduce cost and to compete better. Second is, again, training. Training is a thing in which ports are used to work in a cooperative mode. In terms of, not only in terms of offshore, but in other sectors, we have a very good example in Barcelona that is called the European School for Short Sea Shipping, that is based on the cooperation of several ports at the Med level. We have the Med Ports Associations. And last but not least, I give you a very concrete examples on funding. Okay. So far, Connecting Euro Facility, the mechanism for the Trans-European Net to fund the development in ports of the Trans-European Net for Transport, was funding isolated EU ports to develop offshore wind capabilities. Okay, as it was for the Irish and for others. This is not going to happen anymore. With the new multi-annual financial framework, due to the fact that a number of funds will be also dedicated to other things, and you know which ones. The key factor will become the cross-border projects. So Europe will fund more and more cross-border projects, meaning that if you want to have money from Europe for wind farm developing ports, you need to cooperate with another one that is not in your country. And this is a very good, another good reason to do that.
Oui, je pense que Xavier Guillou.
Yes, Xavier Guillou, I'm sure is going to agree with you. I would like to tackle a very sensitive question. It's the question of our relationship with China and the link between Italy and China, But this is, I would like to have the view of Alexandre Frémaux, Xavier Guilloux on this Chinese industrial Mingyan that has forged agreements with the Italian government for a project offshore in Sicily, but in Scotland, Germany. So I'm maybe a bit blunt, but this idea of Italy, which would be the Troy horse of China in the sector, to arrive with some wind turbines that are more powerful, of course, than the biggest one that we produce by Vestas or Siemens. So there's a competitive advantage on the Chinese side. If I look at the last call for tenders, we're fighting against those type of machines. So simply, you are at the heart of the topic with the local industrials. Where is this project at? Because it's raised a lot of attention in Europe, the Mingan project. And I was imagining to have a plant, of a manufacturing plant at the heart of Europe, at the heart of the Mediterranean, in your country, in Italy. What is the reality on this?
For sure, what I learned from since a couple of years ago is that if we are really developing all the gigawatts that we are thinking to have in the Med on floating, it will be very difficult for the European industry to deal with. Okay, that's what we have been listening also this morning. And this is a fact. Okay, then moving to how to cooperate with China. This is another layer, okay? The example we have in Italy, okay, it could be an example. I don't want to give go too much into that because it's not my full understanding. But what I, for sure, this is my personal opinion, is that we have been learning from other sectors that maybe a different way of understanding how to deal with China could be better, you know. And I think I'm talking about automotive now. That we know very very well what's happening now, okay, with the automotive industry and with Chinese cars. So we would need also in this case an European approach, being an European Union approach on this, more than a member state one, in order to, because it's a geopolitical issue. Of course, member states are free to do what they want, and Italy had this. What is important is that sort of a level playing field. So they come here to play with European framework, European regulations, employing European people, you know. And this could be the minimum level to have whoever is not only Chinese, okay, whoever is coming here to develop, if it is for supporting the development of an industry. More than that, it's really a matter of industrial political choice that is up to the member states and to the European Union to go for.
Ouais. Merci Alexio.
Thank you, Alexio. Maybe Xavier
J'ai aussi en tête
would like to speak. EnerGaïa. How does that? How could you sum that up? What's happening with this Chinese manufacturer?
Là, on parle de marché.
Here we're talking about
pour l'instant,
markets.
Non concret. Le marché italien, il y a un potentiel technique qui est documenté.
Documented technical potential.
De lancement d'appel d'offres. Donc, ce qui est intéressant, c'est de voir le marché européen mature et qui sont les principaux acteurs sur le sujet. Ils sont une très large majorité européens, avec des spécialisations notamment dans la supply chain,
specialized in the supply chain,
techniques d'installation de services, sur lesquels certains opérateurs chinois sont déjà présents. On voit une coopération importante autour de EnerGaïa. Il y a cette volonté que sur les marchés dans lesquels nous sommes des marchés en forte croissance majeure pour la transition verte et importante pour notre autonomie stratégique. L'Europe garde un contrôle et un leadership. Il y a aussi des éléments de sécurité pour lesquels les États membres sont responsables et attentifs.
We have to be very careful about that. We have a question on that.
La question de la sécurité, donc
security. The person asking the question was referring to the gas pipelines in the Baltic Sea, which were cut. Is Europe looking carefully at the risk involved in these big offshore wind farms in terms of security and energy supply, etc., etc.?
Je pense que l'Europe, tout le monde s'intéresse à la sécurité des infrastructures stratégiques majeures. C'est pas propre aux nouveau dans le secteur éolien parce qu'elles deviennent des infrastructures de grande taille et donc majeures. La surveillance de nos strategic assets est présente, notamment sur la Baltique. Peut-être pour finir le point précédent, on a vu un cas, notamment dans un appel d'offres allemand, où sur intervention de critères sécuritaires, il y a eu un vrai travail par rapport à l'éligibilité de composants et de certains éléments des turbines en mer
offshore turbines,
d'opérateurs chinois. Donc c'est aussi un critère de définir
So these are criteria that have to be well defined in terms of safety, security, speed, opportunity, complementarity.
Sachant que le point en termes de sécurité, de cybersécurité est
cybersecurity issue is also crucial.
Poteaux posés en mer et qui peut avoir
these huge masts in the sea, which can be put to different uses.
Et voilà, et en termes il y a un certain nombre de coopérations très importantes en termes de sécurité des infrastructures en mer. Il y a une stratégie
when it comes to the security of offshore infrastructure,
de réseaux sous-marins notamment,
submarine networks, for example, where there's a lot of cooperation in monitoring and surveillance, innovation and research linked to drones. Observation. It's a real issue. It can be the topic of a forthcoming roundtable at EnerGaïa next year. Alexandra, what about the Mingan case in Europe? Because we talked about Italy. There are links with Scotland, with Germany. And what does Wind Europe think about all this?
Je pense qu'il y a beaucoup de choses intéressantes qui ont été dites.
There are a lot of interesting things that have been said.
Un regard critique sur la situation.
One can look critically at the situation.
De gros titres encore une fois de journaux sur cette situation
avec cette velléité d'acteurs chinois notamment Minen qui tapent à nos portes au marché européen notamment offshore.
Je pense que c'est avant tout très flatteur. D'une certaine manière, ça prouve que le marché éolien européen a un futur, a une vision et un potentiel, en tout cas à court, moyen, long terme. Donc c'est une bonne chose. Maintenant, il y a eu deux points qui ont été mentionnés par Xavier et par Alexio, sur lesquels je voudrais revenir. C'est Wind Europe est complètement OK avec la compétition, j'ai envie de dire, tant que celle-ci est juste. Et justement, ce que Alexio mentionnait, c'était que les acteurs européens sur le marché européen travaillent et sont en compétition en suivant certaines règles, notamment les règles de l'OCDE. Ces mêmes règles ne sont pas suivies par les acteurs chinois, ce qui leur confère un certain avantage compétitif qui ne serait pas juste s'ils venaient travailler sur notre marché. Il y a un certain rapport justement de l'OCDE qui mentionnait des subsides par l'État chinois aux acteurs chinois qui rendraient leur projet bien plus viable et donc encore une fois avec un avantage compétitif. La Commission européenne, et vous avez peut-être confirmé, mais a depuis 2024 lancé une enquête justement sur ces subsides irréguliers au vu des règles européennes, dans le cas où un acteur chinois souhaiterait venir s'implémenter en Europe. On n'a pas toujours les résultats de cette enquête, mais en tout cas, elle sera scrutée avec grande attention par nous. Le deuxième point, si vous le permettez, sur lequel je voulais revenir, et qui est également important, et qui fait rebond avec ce que je racontais au tout départ, c'est le fait que l'éolien en mer, on est passé d'un stade où c'est un levier, un outil pour atteindre nos objectifs climatiques à un levier de sécurité d'approvisionnement en énergie. Et donc, également, Xavier l'a mentionné, on est passé sur un stade où c'est des assets stratégiques et donc à protéger. Et donc, on ne peut pas se permettre d'avoir des machines qui potentiellement seraient connectées avec un État qui n'est pas forcément aligné avec toutes les positions de l'Union européenne et de l'Europe de manière générale. On a connu dans les années précédentes, depuis l'invasion de l'Ukraine par la Russie, un choc énergétique où on a réalisé qu'on était totalement dépendant d'un point de vue énergétique, notamment gazier, de la Russie, et donc d'un État hostile. L'Union européenne a mis en place des mesures pour justement pallier cette dépendance, notamment avec une diversification des apports énergétiques, notamment en gaz. C'est en cours. L'Union européenne a d'ailleurs annoncé la semaine dernière que se donner jusqu'à 2027, il me semble, pour couper tous les approvisionnements en gaz venant de la Russie. C'est une très bonne chose. Maintenant, on n'a pas envie de passer d'une dépendance énergétique gazière venant de la Russie à une dépendance technologique venant d'un autre État.
We don't want to move from that to another form of dependency. Well, the problem we might encounter is that in this race to become very gigantic, and offshore wind, floating wind in particular, will become very gigantic because we're far from the coast, the infrastructures will be huge, there'll be ever more powerful machines to amortize the costs. The catalogue of European manufacturers in offshore wind, there are only 2, there aren't 50. And we're talking about a ceiling of 20 megawatts. So perhaps it's the responsibility of Europeans not to meet the demand emerging there. But if we do that, then we open the door to the ones that do put in bids, the Chinese. It's a good question. But one could start by saying that European industry has enough capacity to meet all the need for facilities. In the graph I showed you at the very beginning, I said that we stand at 37 gigawatts installed. Last year we installed about 3 gigawatts, and this year I think we'll install many more. We did an exercise with industry
en 2025,
in 2025, this year,
pour estimer justement quelle est notre capacité manufacturière
annuelle
d'installation. Aujourd'hui, on est aux alentours de 7 à 8 gigawatts d'installation annuelle. Donc, vous pouvez comprendre, il y a encore de la marge. Il y a encore de la marge avant d'atteindre ces leviers. Et en plus de ça, grâce aux investissements qui ont été faits lors des 3-4 dernières années, on parle de 14 millions principalement pour l'offshore wind. On va monter en termes de capacité manufacturière à horizon 2030 à 10 gigawatts. En termes de capacité d'installation, l'industrie européenne se suffit aujourd'hui à elle-même. C'est la première réponse qu'on apporte à la question de est-ce qu'on a besoin de plus d'acteurs. Sur le deuxième point, et c'est votre question, notamment au niveau de la disponibilité des produits, aujourd'hui il est vrai que le catalogue de disponibilité des principaux acteurs européens se limite à 15 mégawatts. En tout cas pour le moment, et c'est là-dessus que je veux insister parce que forcément les acteurs européens regardent à long terme et voient ce que les développeurs ont besoin en termes de produits. Et là-dessus, là, je vais mentionner notamment la turbine en test au Danemark de Siemens qui atteint un taux de 21 mégawatts. Donc là, on s'alignerait avec ce qui est fait en Chine. Cela étant dit, la Chine, et là je prends le cas particulier de Mingyang, n'a pas encore mentionné d'amener des produits au-delà de 18,5 mégawatts, il me semble. Le projet par exemple qui a beaucoup fait pareil il y a 2 semaines de cela, d'installer une usine en Écosse à Ardésier, c'est pour une turbine de 18 mégawatts. Donc là-dessus, on reste sur des segments similaires avec ce qui se fait déjà aujourd'hui.
So we're talking about specific segments and things already being done. Thank you. We have 5 minutes to take a few questions. Are there any in the room? Question. Which French metallurgy company is in a good position? Well, we can't answer that in this round table, sorry. But we could take other questions. I have a question. FER2. Maybe that's a specific auction. I don't know. I don't understand the question, says the speaker. In Italy and other European countries? Is there a pluri-annual energy program or planning process?
There is a sort of the FAIR 2 is where the government is going to release the intention to the policy intention, okay, and where the tenders and auctions should be linked to.
Et en effet, ça doit être lié à toutes ces options dont on a parlé tout à l'heure.
OK.
Okay, thank you.
Est-ce qu'il y a des questions?
Are there any questions? There's the microphone available. Don't be shy. I guess you're all hungry. A question?
Pas casser le matériel tout de suite. Sur de la logistique. Oui, pour après ce qui se passe derrière. Vous voulez annoncer quelque chose? Il y a une annonce sympathique. Oui.
Bon, juste dire rapidement pour ceux qui sont inscrits, vous ne m'entendez pas.
You can't hear me? Yes, we can all hear. I just wanted to say very quickly, for those who registered for Windhoek, everything is ready. We're waiting for you outside. Go to the left as you leave the room, and everything is signposted to the, it's signposted as a private event, or a side event, I beg your pardon. So everything is there, and everything is ready to welcome you. That's a very nice invitation. Thank you. So if there are no further questions, I would like to thank our speakers, those who are in Brussels, those who are here with us in Brussels. Thank you very much.
D'avoir répondu à des questions qui n'étaient pas toujours faciles.
The questions weren't always easy to answer. That's the least one can say. Enjoy the remainder of EnerGaïa and look forward to seeing you again soon.